Hi everyone! Today we'll be concluding the sewing of our dress. We'll be creating a puff sleeve with gathers along the cap and a facing to finish off the bottom edge. Then we'll be sewing that sleeve onto our princess line bodice. Let's get started. You should have cut out already 2 puff sleeves with fullness up at the cap, as well as 2 facings that we'll use to finish the bottom edge of the puff sleeves. The facings also need interfacing to correspond with them. I've gone ahead and used my iron to fuse the interfacing in place already, so we can move right on ahead to our sewing. The first stage in our sewing process will be to sew 2 rows of basting stitches along the cap of the sleeve, from the double notches at the back all the way around to the single notches at the front. To do this, we're going to be using a long stitch length, around 5 millimeters or so, and we'll be sewing 2 rows of stitches along that area. We'll want to be sure to leave excess thread at the beginning and end and not backstitch. We'll be sewing our gathering stitches at 1/4 inch seam allowance and then again at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. This will help us to really gather all that excess fabric in because our gathering stitches will be happening both inside and outside of our actual seam line at 1/2 inch seam allowance. For sewing our gathering stitches, make sure your machine is set to your 5 millimeter stitch length before you start and that you already have about 6 inches of thread coming off behind the presser foot. We'll sew the first row at 1/4 inch seam allowance and then repeat again at 5/8 seam allowance. So begin at your double notches. And stop when you reach the single notch. Leave thread. And repeat for the second row at 5/8. Now repeat the same thing for the other sleeve. The next step will be sewing the underseam of our sleeves as well as our facings. So start by positioning your sleeves so that you're sure you're going to be creating a left sleeve and a right sleeve, meaning you're observing your notches, the singles and the doubles, and having them placed so that they're a mirror image of one another before you bring your underseams together. Once they're laid out like this, then you can easily grab one and bring it over so the right sides are together, and do the same over here. The underseam of our puff sleeve is just this short little seam right here. So we're going to be pinning that and then stitching it at 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching both ends. Line up your edges, pin the beginning, then the end. And it doesn't hurt to throw one more in the middle since this is on the bias of the fabric. While we're at it, let's go ahead and pin the underseam of our facings as well. We've already fused our interfacing in place, which turns that into the wrong side of the fabric. So make sure you bring the right sides of the fabric together as you pin your underseams. And then you'll pin them the same way you did on the sleeve. The underseam of the facing is a little bit shorter than the sleeve though, so we can probably get by with just those 2 pins rather than adding the third one into the center. Now the underseam on the facing will be stitched the exact same way that we are doing on the sleeve, which means 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitch at both ends. Before we sew our underseams, be sure that you've returned your machine's stitch length to about 2.5 millimeters. That's a good stitch length for any standard sewing that we're doing beyond special processes like gathering. Begin with a back stitch and sew at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other sleeve. Now we'll also be repeating that process for the underseams of our facings. After sewing your underseams, you'll also want to go in and trim the loose threads off of the end of your seams, but be sure to leave your gathering stitch threads behind. We still need those. Next, we're going to be using the iron and pressing all of our seam allowances for the underseams open. That means pressing them open on both the sleeves as well as the facings. Starting with our first sleeve, you'll just want to press right over the top of the stitches. And then with the help of a sleeve board, you can press the seam allowances open. First from the wrong side. And then flip it around and give a quick press from the right side as well. Now repeat the same pressing technique for the facings. Next, we'll be pinning and sewing our facing onto the bottom edge of the sleeve. The best way to do this is to start with your sleeve inside out and your facing right side out. Then you can take your facing, bring it down inside your sleeve, and you have the right sides of the fabric perfectly positioned together. So as you bring it around, make sure that you have the underseams on the same side so that they can match up. That's where your first pin is going to go. So align them, pin right through the middle of that seam, check it on the other side, weave it back through. Okay, and then next, you want to make sure the two layers of fabric are nicely evenly distributed and have your next pin go on the far side of the sleeve, opposite of your underseam. And now we can continue to pin by splitting each portion in half. Now go ahead and pin the other sleeve the same way. Once you have your facings pinned in place on both sleeves, we'll be stitching all the way around at 1/4 inch seam allowance. For stitching around a tight circle like we're about to do on the bottom of our sleeve, a lot of machines have what they call a free arm, where you can remove a portion of the machine over here and be left with basically an arm to wrap your fabric around as you sew. But not all machines have that, mine included. So instead, when you're going to be sewing a tight circle, it's best to basically sew from inside the circle, from sort of the bottom edge of it, so that the rest of the fabric continues up and over. You actually have pretty good visibility this way as you're sewing the circle. So I'm going to come in right here, and we want to start our seam at the underseam point, that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Whenever you're sewing a complete circle, it's not usually necessary to backstitch both the beginning and the end. So I usually elect to not backstitch at the beginning, but then when we come around and finish, we'll overlap our starting point by a few stitches and backstitch there, and that should be enough to hold our seam in place. So just keep pulling your fabric forward, rotating it towards you to the next section. All right, coming up on the finish line, so just cross where you started by a bit and then backstitch. Repeat for the other sleeve. Now that our facings are sewn on, we want to do an understitching along that seam. This is going to help the facing stay tucked to the inside of the sleeve and not try to fold itself outward, as well as give us a sharper finish around the hem of the sleeve. With how we sewed the seam of our facing, we did it with our sleeve in its inside out position, but for this next stage of pressing, it's actually really helpful if you flip it the opposite direction. So flip your sleeve now so that the sleeve itself is right side out and you have your facing on the outside. Then come in with the sleeve board, and if we place it on here, we can take our facing and fold it downward like that. And we want to be sure that we're pressing the seam of the facing towards the facing itself, not towards the sleeve. So check underneath, make sure you're going in the correct direction, and then using just the tip of your iron, press that seam in place. So reach underneath, pull the seam towards the facing, and continue pressing. And really try to not run your iron over the whole facing, or else you'll end up with some ugly folds. Once your seam has been pressed towards the facing, now we'll be ready to take it over to the sewing machine and apply our understitch, which will be edge stitching about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam to attach the seam allowance to the facing. For doing our understitching, I've gone ahead and returned the sleeve to its inside out position. That'll allow us to sew the understitching from inside the circle while still being on the right side of the fabric to see the seam. So we're going to start at the underseam, and we'll do an edge stitch about 1/16 of an inch over from our seam to stitch the facing to the seam allowances. Now for the other sleeve. And there we go, understitched to perfection. Now that our understitching is complete, we can take our facing and fold it upwards towards the sleeve and press around the bottom edge for a nice clean finish. Just place it right on the sleeve board. Fold that facing up, and you could already see it wanting to naturally crease along the seam where the understitching is. So get your seam right at the edge. Use your iron and press all the way around. Oh, God, I love understitching. Now that our facing is pressed upwards, we're going to do one more quick trick that will really help to keep the facing in that upward position so that it doesn't flop down and try to come out from the bottom of the sleeve. We're going to do a little tack right here, right on the top edge of the facing, and we'll be stitching exactly in the seam. This technique is called stitch in the ditch because you're stitching right in the ditch of the seam itself. So right at the edge of the facing here, we're going to do a quick little forward, back, forward, about 3 to 4 stitches long. And we do it in the ditch so that on the right side of the garment, we don't have visible stitches on a place other than the seam. That keeps them nice and hidden while it holds our facing upwards. Now for the tack we're about to sew, it's a little tricky to get in there, but I'm going to kind of bring my sleeve in from the back like this. So all the excess fabric of the sleeve is behind where we're sewing. And I want to make sure that my two underseams are positioned right on top of one another. And then stitch right on the seam itself, about 3 or 4 stitches, forward, forward, and then maybe even back again. And that will help our facing stay upwards. Now that we've finished assembling our sleeves, we can move ahead and start attaching them onto our bodice at the armhole. We really want to make sure that the correct sleeve goes onto the correct armhole, so this process right here is going to make sure that we do that properly. If you start with both your dress right side out and your sleeves right side out, being sure to have the single notches of your sleeves facing up, as well as the front of your dress facing up, then your sleeves will end up on the correct armholes. So from this point, you can take one side of your dress and fold it open to almost turn the dress inside out, bringing your sleeve into the armhole like this. And the first point you want to match up with the sleeve and the armhole will be your side seam of your bodice with the underseam of your sleeve. That's going to be the point that you'll pin first. So really match those seams up. And pin them together. Next, we want to pin your single notches and your double notches. So come to the front of the armhole, make sure that you have a single to a single, and pin the notches together. Then come over to your double notches. Make sure that you have a double matching up to a double and pin them together. The last notch that is very crucial that we want to make sure gets placed properly is your notch way up here at the top of your sleeve cap. This notch needs to match up to your shoulder seam, so pin that next. Okay, now that we have all of our key checkpoints matched up, we're going to be pulling the threads from our gathering stitch to help draw all this excess from the sleeve cap inwards. And we want to be evenly distributing the gathers as much as possible while we pin that gathered section of the sleeve into the armhole. So just do one half of the sleeve at a time. Come all the way down here and find your threads on the side of your sleeve here. Make sure you grab only those two from the side of the fabric facing up, and then you want to pinch and pull. Scoot the gathers down a bit, pull the thread a little more. And we still have a ways to go. We want to keep gathering this until all that excess fabric of the sleeve fits into the same amount of space that we have for the armhole. Keep pulling. Also be sure that you always pull both of the threads evenly. It helps if you kind of wrap them around your finger. Otherwise, it's kind of like when you try to pull the cord on blinds and you pull one a little bit more than the other and the blinds go all crazy. So try to pull the threads evenly and just keep working at those gathers. Okay, so at this point, the gathers fit into that space of the armhole nicely, but we still want to kind of slide them around a little bit back and forth to make sure that they're nice and even. So it looks like I may have to bring some of this a little bit more up towards the cap. And just adjust and adjust. Once they're starting to look nice and even, then you can proceed with pinning. And you want to have a good amount of pins on this section to really keep those gathers spread out nicely. First pin in the middle, then we'll go in the middle of these two. Adjust as you go if necessary. Okay, now we can go ahead and do the same thing on the other half of the sleeve. After your gathers are pinned in place, repeat the same process for the other sleeve, and then we'll be ready to sew. We'll be stitching all the way around the armhole at our 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting and finishing at the side seam. For sewing our sleeve, we want to come from inside the circle again, and we want to be starting right at the side seam underseam point. So just get right in there, and remember we want to be on our 1/2 inch line. Although the armhole definitely has some awkward curves to it. So when you're sewing around these curves, remember that the only point at which you need to be matched to your seam allowance line is right here, straight across from the needle. Even if your fabric is veering off and covering it at the front, this is the point at which it really matters for you to be on the line. So that's what you want to look out for as you go. Sew it in small sections and just kind of keep rolling it forward towards you. Okay, one sleeve down, one to go. Once you've finished sewing your sleeves on, we can go ahead and remove the basting stitches that we used to create the gathers. Now that the sleeve is in place, their purpose has been served, and we can use a seam ripper to gently pick them away. Sometimes you just have to find the end of it and pluck a couple stitches up, and then you can slide the whole thing out. Even if it breaks a little along the way, it still speeds up the process to do it in sections. Okay. Remember, we have the 2 rows of that. We have the 5/8 and we have the 1/4. So both of those can come out, and all that will remain is our seam, sewed at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now as we go ahead and turn our garment right side out, we can see this lovely puff sleeve we created. Normally on a sleeve, we want the seam allowance of the armhole to be pressed outward toward the sleeve. For a fitted sleeve, this actually helps to fill the cap out nicely and give it more shape. Although with a puff sleeve, if we were to press it in that direction with the iron, sometimes the iron may come along and just brutalize those nice little gathers we've created and flatten them down. We don't want that to happen. So what we're gonna do is actually just gently finger press the seam allowance toward the sleeve. So come underneath and just use your fingertips and your thumbs to sort of crease the beginning of the gathered section so that the seam allowance will lay towards the sleeve, but that we're not crushing these nice little gathers along the way. Just kind of work your way around and be folding the gathered section. Before presenting your dress, you'll want to go over and give it a final pressing. The fabric can tend to get wrinkled throughout the sewing process, so even if you pressed one portion of it earlier on in the assignment, it's definitely a good idea to go and give it a nice presentation-worthy pressing. Well, well, well. Here she is in all her glory, our completed classic dress with a princess line bodice, convertible collar, A-line skirt, and big fluffy puff sleeves. Join me next time for more tips, techniques, and tutorials. I'm Ivy Vining with House of Vining. See you later, everyone.